Hi there, students. In the last lecture, I discussed about waste management law, and I believe if you watch this channel, YouTube channel, you will also come across an infographic on the 25 years of this evolution of international climate policy. Now, in today's lecture, I wish to discuss uh, climate law as since the inception of this entire international legal framework from the Framework Convention on Climate Change. In several occasions, I have referred to this Framework Convention on Climate Change in our previous discussions. So, in today's lecture, in the first part of this lecture, I'll discuss about some key principles and the crucial aspects relating to the commitments which have been pretty much clearly envisaged in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, if you refer to the preamble part of this particular convention, in fact, the thing is that these international legal instruments and their preambles usually they kind of focuses on several pre-existing acknowledges several pre-existing international legal instruments with respect to that area. It can be, say, for example, United Nations General Assembly resolution. It can be some other convention already in force, and it can also be several other, reference to existing UN Charter or even other framework treaty, bilateral, multilateral, so on and so forth. Now, in the preamble part of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which you already are aware, came in the year 1992 as an outcome of the Rio summit, the parties to this particular convention clearly acknowledged the change in the climate of this planet and adverse effects of on this particular climate because of human activities, direct, indirect. So it is a prime concern of mankind, so called the common concern of mankind. So the first line of the convention itself highlights and acknowledges the change in the Earth's climate and the adverse effects, which is a common concern of mankind. If you remember, and I have discussed about something called common heritage of mankind, which was pretty much like, there in the United Nations Convention on Law of Seas. When it comes to this common concern of mankind, the amplitude of the same is even wider. It's not just not talk about a particular ecosystem or a particular species, it takes everything as a whole. So it's a matter of common concern that has been clearly highlighted in the preamble of the Framework Convention. Thereafter, the drafters have also expressed their concerns with respect to human activities, which has substantially enhanced over a period of time and led to, the concentrations of anthropogenic greenhouse gases. And this increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gases, which of course, as you know, the scientific mechanism of greenhouse effect, is responsible for the rise in the global temperature. In fact, the adverse effect on this environment is because of these anthropogenic gases and its release, which in fact resulted in an average additional warming of this planet's surface and atmosphere. And it also may affect adversely the natural ecosystems and the humankind. So, environment as well as human health have been prime concerns for the particular convention and its drafters. In addition to that, the the when it comes to historical background of the Framework Convention, they have also acknowledged the historical injustice in a way. Injustice in the sense, not that language which I'm mentioning here as injustice has not been used, but they have clearly noted that a larger share of this current global emissions and of course the historical global emissions of these greenhouse anthropogenic gases was originated from developed countries, and their per capita emissions, which if you compare it with the developing countries, are relatively high, and the share of the global emissions, which basically are originating from these developed countries, will definitely has definitely contributed to this emissions. Escalation in the global temperature. And when it comes to the share of global emissions which are originating from developing countries, it will definitely grow in the days to come because they too also have to meet their socio-economic and development needs. So all the the historical aspects as well as the current and the future has been clearly highlighted in the preamble. So this is something which none of us can deny. This is a fact. So they were all aware of these things. In fact, besides this, an ecosystem approach has also been taken where the preamble highlighted the importance of marine ecosystem, the importance of terrestrial ecosystems, and the significance of sinks and reservoirs of these greenhouse gases in these ecosystems. And they have noted out that many such uncertainties in the prediction of climate change, especially with respect to the magnitude or the regional pattern, or even the timing, has significantly been a matter of great concern. And there is a lot of uncertainties which are still there. And these uncertainties is, of course, a clear indication that we have to remain prepared. We have to be very much precautious at the same point of time. Now, acknowledging the global nature of the climate change, which in fact has been clearly highlighted in the very initial preamble part, forces us to think about it. And this framework convention calls for a widest possible cooperation of all the countries, irrespective of their socio-economic differences. It also calls out for participation in an effective and appropriate international response, which should be, of course, in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which I have mentioned, which I have already discussed in the initial lectures, offline lectures, of course, where if you remember, if you don't, then please do refer to the material that I've shared by Philip Sands on principles of international environmental law, the common but differentiated responsibility, right? The brunt should be borne by the developed countries. So this particular principle, the common but differentiated principle, and respective capabilities and their socio-economic conditions to be taken into consideration. The Framework Convention also recalls the pertinent provisions of the Stockholm Conference from 1972, 20 years back. From that point of time, it also recalls that the states have, of course, in accordance with the UN Charter, recognize all those principles like the principle of equity, the principle of neighboring principle, in the sense the principle of permanent sovereignty and not to cause damage to your neighbors, also known as a neighboring principle, and of course the international cooperation, principle of sovereignty of states and international cooperation to address climate change. So these basic principles, which are also their part and parcel of the UN Charter, have been recognized under the preamble elements of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Along with that, it has also recognized that the states should enact effective environmental legislations, in which they will adopt certain environmental standards, management objectives, priorities, which should reflect the developmental, environmental context to which they apply. And these standards are basically applied by some countries, which may be appropriate and unwarranted economic and social costs to other countries, in particular developing countries, should be taken into account. So this element of differentiation is justified on the basis of the history and also keeping in mind the future. Uh, Along with that, several other resolutions, so-called United Nations General Assembly resolutions, were recognized, like 44 to 28 of 1989 and 44 to 06 of 1989, and then this 45 to 12 of 1990 and 4353 of 1988. These are all with respect to global climate for present and future generations of mankind. These resolutions are also emphasizing on environment and development. So, in addition to that, when it comes to 44 to oh 06 of 1999, that was especially with respect to rise in sea levels, which became a matter of great concern for island states and coastal states, because the coastals and the small island countries, geopolitically, they don't have that kind of influence, and at the same point of time, they are also very vulnerable to climate change. So this convention, in fact, recalled the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 44 to oh 06 of 1989, which was on possible adverse effect of sea level rise on islands and coastal areas, and also certain low-lying coastal areas. Along with that, the 44172 of 1998, 1989, which in fact deals with combating desertification, that has also been recalled by was also recalled by this particular framework convention on climate change. Another major international instrument which kind of was clear reflection of good international cooperation was the Vienna Convention for the Protection of Ozone Layer 1985 and the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer of 1987, which was also further amended in 1990. These two legal instruments were also recalled by the framers of Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was basically for ozone to combat ozone depletion. Along with that, several other ministerial declaration of the Second World Climate Conference of 1990 was also kind of, and several other international organizations and bodies like World Meteorological Organization, then United Nations Environment Program, then Intergovernmental Plan on Climate Change. Their valuable analytical work has also been have been recognized by the drafters of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Along with that, three important things were also recognized, which I would like to mention here. First and foremost is that in order to understand and address the climate change, there is a dire need for an environmentally, socially, and economically effective approach, which should be based on relevant scientific, technical, and economic considerations. And these considerations should not be just one time job. It should be continuously re-evaluated from time to time. Along with that, the second thing is that the various actions to address climate change can be justified economically in their own right, and it can also help in solving other environmental problems. The third factor is recognizing the need for certain countries. Like, for example, on one side, you have the need for these developed countries to take immediate action in a flexible manner, of course, and at the same point of time, also to recognize the interests of small island, low lying countries, especially the developing countries whose economies are particularly developed, are dependent on conventional sources of energy like fossil fuels production. So, or even their use or exportations, the consequences of action that's been taken on limiting greenhouse gases. These countries, they have their respective approaches, and all their interests have to be taken into account. So when it comes to developed countries, upon them lies the responsibility to take immediate action in a flexible manner on the basis of clear priorities, as a first step towards a very comprehensive response strategy, not in just their national level, but also in a global level. And if so possible, if they agree in a regional level, then that should also take into account all the greenhouse gases with due considerations of their relative contribution to the enhancement of greenhouse effect. When it comes to low-lying and other small island countries, these countries are like very much vulnerable. Even some of the developing countries, they have coastal areas, they have low-lying coastal, arid, semi-arid areas. They have also areas which are prone to floods, drought, desertifications, including India, for example. Despite the fact it's a developing country, it also has fragile mountainous ecosystems. So this is something which they have to take into consideration when they take any international measure. And when it comes to the special difficulties, especially the developing countries are facing, along with the vulnerabilities, is that of their economy. They are still relying on, dependent on available fossil fuel production, or maybe they export it or they use it and use it for economic benefit in a way. So this is something which is a very difficult factor because they have their respective approaches, the developing countries, developed countries, and try to bring a consonance amongst these interests is the challenge which framework convention faced at that point of time. The Paris Agreement is facing this point, and during this point of time, and I'm pretty sure that this debate and negotiation will never stop because there are always certain, on one side you will find people who are talking about climate negotiation in very pro-enviro angle. And there are also on the other side, we are talking about climate negotiation in a very economic oriented angle. But when it comes to the balance between these two, there comes the major challenge. So, in a way, the Framework Convention tries to balance this. They try to, understand and gather as well as adopt an approach which tries to balance, which tries to kind of mitigate, adapt all these challenges by taking something which will serve the interests of both. That is all global negotiation is, right? That is all negotiation is. So, this framework convention affirms this fact of the challenges associated with climate change. It also, affirm the fact that there is a dire need for a coordinated approach, an integrated approach to avoid adverse effects, further adverse effects on climate change. And there is also need to recognize that all countries, especially the developing countries, they need to access to resources which are required to achieve their sustainable socio-economic development. So, having determined all these things, and to protect the climate system of not just current generation but also future generation, this particular framework convention was adopted. There, you will find that climate change has also been defined. Climate change, basically, as per this particular framework convention, if you refer to Article 1, Clause 2 of UNFCCC, there you will find that climate change has been defined as the change which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. So it's a means of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity. So human activity is responsible either directly or indirectly. And because of this human activity, there is an alteration in the composition of global atmosphere. Here they're referring to just atmosphere, but when you say atmosphere, of course, it in fact covers a lot, and which in addition to natural climate variability, in fact covers a wider array of issues, climate related issues. In fact, climate system, the term that they have used here in the framework convention, has also been defined as a totality of atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, geosphere, and their interactions. So the climate system, in fact, as a whole, has been taken into consideration. So where not just because if you look into the definition of adverse effects of climate change, that has also been defined under Article 1, Clause 1, that means the changes in the physical environment or biota, which is resulting from climate change, which have significant deleterious effects on compositions, resilience, or even productivity of natural and managed ecosystems, or any operation of socio-economic systems, or on human health and welfare. So climate systems basically, takes into consideration atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, geosphere, and their interactions and their adverse effects. Basically means the change in the physical environment or biota resulting for climate change. Along with that, greenhouse gases has also been defined, which is not scientific though, but they have defined it. Emissions is another crucial definition, which you will find under the Framework Convention, which basically means the release of greenhouse gases and or their precursors into the atmosphere over a specific area and period of time. They haven't specified the exact time, like specified area and period of time. I mean, besides this, three another definitions that you will come across here, which are important, is the reservoir, sink, and sources. These are basically the components of climate change in a way, where you'll find these greenhouse gases are stored, like forests, for example. Forests are carbon sinks, right, or carbon reservoirs. And because of the normal scientific phenomena, you know that they inhale CO2 and they exhale oxygen. So carbon dioxides and other like greenhouse gases are kind of stored in these reservoirs and in these forests. So if you deforest, then definitely that will lead to escalation in greenhouse gases. So the sources, sinks, and reservoirs have also been defined under Article 1 of the Framework Convention. When it comes to the objective of the convention, the prime objective, which has been very crystal clear, envisaged under Article 2, says that this particular framework convention intends to achieve, in accordance with the relevant provisions of the convention, stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that the food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So here you see, first is to achieve in accordance with relevant provisions, stabilization of greenhouse gases concentrations. That's the first thing. And of course at a level which should be achieved in the time frame sufficient to allow. So they haven't said that by tonight itself or by this particular time period itself. It will take certain time, and they haven't said that 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. So they have said that should be achieved in a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems and adapt naturally to climate change. So this is then secondly to ensure food production is not threatened. So basically agriculture should not be threatened, because food production, if you talk about climate related measures, many a times several such sectors, let's keep these sectors in mind, because whenever you study climate change law or even economics relating to climate change, you will find a sectoral approach. Which are these sectors? Well, for example, agriculture is one sector, industry is a sector, energy, transport, and then you have other relevant sectors which of course plays a very key role, like for example real estate, because that is something which again plays a significant role in climate change. You will wonder why. Of course, you know the science behind it, that leads to encroachments of certain areas which might be eco-sensitive in nature. We have seen that. And along with this, industry, agriculture, real estate, transport also is contributing a lot, because emissions out of the vehicles which are used in transportations, or even for our own purposes in day-to-day life, emissions are kind of very much high. As you all know, we've been following news that because of COVID-19 and nationwide lockdown across several countries, the pollution level drastically came down, and they are showing record of, like, in last 25 years, 30 years, you haven't seen this much of drastic fall in emissions. So you know how far the transport is contributing. Industries are closed, so that is also leading to drop in the temperature, as well as the air quality is getting far better. So, food production is one such area, because, when it comes to food production, even several means and modes of agricultural productions have been subject of debate and criticism. Like, for example, the June cultivation of this particular part of the country, or shifting cultivation, has been criticized by several climate scientists, saying that it's not environmentally sound. But on the other hand, there are also opponents saying that's a traditional mode of cultivation which has nothing to do with climate change. It doesn't contribute to emissions. So these kind of things are also there. So, but in the way, the bottom line is that the food production should not be threatened. So you see, this is a message that you should not be that much pro enviro also, which threatens several other sectors, and food being related to agriculture is one such sector. In addition to that, enabling economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner is, in one liner, says a lot. When it comes to economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner, as you all know, the meaning of sustainable development, we have discussed about it, the concept of sustainable development, it speaks a lot. It talks about intergenerational equity, it talks about intragenerational equity, it talks about integration of economics and environment, it talks about, now at this point of time, when we have the sustainable development goals, it just doesn't talk about development and environment. It talks about human rights, it talks about armed conflicts, humanitarian aspects, it talks about gender equality. So it talks about so many things, and they have all taken in a very integrated fashion. So even the factor of sustainable development has also kind of evolved in last couple of decades, and this is somewhere you will find, even now, when you use the term sustainable manner, and from this current juncture, when you try to understand and comprehend sustainable manner, your understanding is far wider than that of what it was way back in 1972. So Paris Agreement sustainable manner understanding will be far more comprehensive in comparison to the 1970 the 1992's UNFCCC. Another aspect is the principles. Now, the principles which guides the guides the this particular climate change is something, negotiation is guided by several principles, and as I've already mentioned, CBDR is one such principle. And along with that, there are other principles which, in fact, we have already discussed, be it the principle of common sovereignty, permanent sovereignty, the principle of equity. But along with that, when it comes to Article 3 of the Framework Convention, it clearly emphasizes the sustainable development, the aspect of intergenerational equity. It talks about the benefit of present and future generations of humankind. Secondly, it talks about the equity. It talks about common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, along with which the developed countries have been given the immense responsibility, take the lead. It also emphasizes on specific needs and special circumstances of developing countries, particularly and especially those that are vulnerable to adverse effects of climate change, and of those parties also which, in fact, especially the developing countries parties, which have to bear a very disproportionate and abnormal burden of under this particular convention, that should bear some full consideration, should be given full consideration under UNFCCC. Thirdly, the principle of precautionary measures. Now, precautionary measures, as I've already discussed in one of the initial lectures, is all about anticipating, about preventing, and minimizing the causes of climate change and to mitigate its adverse effects. So the precautionary principle has been also kind of highlighted, because there they have clearly enshrined that where there is a threat of or any serious or irreversible damage, where there is a lack of scientific certainty, well, it should not be used as a reason for postponing any measures. In fact, you have to take into account the policies and measures to deal with climate change, which should be, of course, cost effective. It should ensure global benefits at lowest possible costs. Now, here is the challenge. And of course, in order to achieve these policies and measures, should also take into account different socioeconomic aspects, different socioeconomic contexts. They should bear in mind whenever they take any such approach, be it adaptation or mitigation. They should consider several sectors. They should comprise, in fact, all the economic sectors, and effort should be given to address the climate change by carrying out in a very cooperative manner. In fact, along with that, the another important principle that this particular framework convention highlight is that each of the parties, they have a right, in fact, to right, and they should also, because they have a right as well as a duty to promote sustainable development. And these policies and measures that they are adopting to protect the climate system from any human induced change should be very appropriate for specific conditions of that particular countries, and it should be integrated with their national developmental plans and programs, so their economic interest should not be affected adversely, or anyways it should not be affected. So here, this is somewhere you will find that the adoption of measures to address climate change has taken a very differentiated approach, but of course at the same point of time an integrated too. And finally, when it comes to cooperation, international cooperation is the guiding factor. So that is another principle, because here the countries have been asked to promote a supportive and an open international economic system should be also adopted, which would lead to a sustainable economic growth. So that these developing countries, they get economic support because they have economic aspirations. And if you talk about bringing emissions down, then they should also get some incentives or support from the other hand. So there should be an open international economic system that would lead to a sustainable economic growth and development in all the parties, especially the developing country parties. So they have emphasized on developing country parties because their issues, their problems should be understood first, then it should be addressed, and then accordingly, any kind of unjustifiable or arbitrary discrimination or disguised restrictions on international trade should be totally abhorred. So that should not be there, because that will be hindrance for economic development at the same point of time. So it should not be disguised restrictions on international trade also at the same point of time. So it's a lot of balancing that you will find that they have emphasized on under principles of UNFCCC under Article 3 of the Framework Convention. When it comes to commitments, I insist you refer to Article 4 because that is very crucial. Article 4 gives a very clear picture of what all UNFCCC is about. Now, when you talk about commitments, we all know commitments is something which either makes us nervous or confident at the same point of time. It also depends to whom we are committing. So, and who is committing. So the thing is that to whom we are committing, who is committing, these two factors are important, and what are we committing. So all these things are important in every facets of life, I believe. But when it comes to climate change, all these parties who are definitely taking into account the CBDR principle, they're at the same point of time they are also considering their national and regional development priorities. They have their respective national and regional objectives and circumstances also. So there they have list out several commitments, basically which are directed towards climate change and addressing climate change, which is directed on the basis of CBDR. So first and foremost is that all the country parties, especially the developed countries, in fact, they have to. This is applicable to develop for developing countries also. They have to develop periodically update, publish, and make available all relevant informations relating to anthropogenic gases. They have to first and foremost develop a national inventory of anthropogenic gases. And when I'm saying they, I mean all the country parties to this framework convention on climate change. So they have to first develop a periodical inventory. They have to develop an inventory, then they have to periodically update it and publish it, and also they have to share that information, make it available for the chief decision making body, which was also established by this convention, also known as the Conference of Parties. I believe I have discussed about it in many of my previous lectures. Thinking about future, so I came across this word future. So they have to make all these national inventories, whatever they are creating or publishing, available with the Conference of Parties. Secondly, they have to formulate, implement, and update national and regional climate change programs on mitigation. So whatever they are doing to measures that they are adopting to mitigate climate change, by addressing the anthropogenic by sources or removals by sinks of all these greenhouse gases, and especially those which are also not covered by Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances, and measures to facilitate adequate adaptation to climate change has also been implemented. So along with mitigation, in fact, adaptation has been, I haven't mentioned it here, but along with mitigation, in fact, with respect to adaptation also, all the country parties have been directed to formulate, implement, update national and regional climate change programs from time to time. It should address, of course, the issues of anthropogenic gases to remove them either from sources or removal by sinks or these greenhouse gases. Promotion of cooperation in development, application, diffusion of technologies, practices, and processes that control, reduce, or prevent greenhouse gases is another thing. And here you will find they have emphasized on technology transfer. So another commitment that they have emphasized over is, along with mitigation and adaptation is technology transfer. So countries have been asked to promote technology, to develop technology, and also to share that information with share that technologies, or even practices, or that in fact is aiming to control, reduce, and prevent anthropogenic gases, emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, the sectors that they have addressed, of course, the sectors besides the Montreal Protocol, the other relevant sectors that they have clearly highlighted here are energy, transport, industry, agriculture, waste management, and forestry. These are some of the sectors that they have mentioned. Besides, promoting sustainable management, promotion and cooperation in conservation enhancement, as appropriate of sinks, reservoirs of greenhouse gases, which are not controlled by Montreal Protocol. That has also been kind of addressed here. Now, here they have emphasized on which sectors? They have emphasized on forests, oceans, biomass, as well as other terrestrial, coastal, and marine ecosystems. So, an ecosystem-based approach has been taken here with respect to which, of course, should be in a very sustainable fashion. Now, they have emphasized on sustainable management of these carbon sinks, reservoirs of these ecosystems like terrestrial, biomass, forestry, oceans, etc., marine to be very specific. Along with that, elaborate and far more developed, appropriate and integrated plan for coastal zone management, water resources management, agriculture, and in fact also for protection and rehabilitation of areas, especially which are in Africa, has been affected by drought and desertification, like flood prone areas. That has also been kind of addressed. So your adaptation measures, so the countries have been asked to cooperate for taking adaptation measures to address the impact of climate change. They have been also asked to take appropriate steps to, address the issue of floods, desertifications, droughts in Africa, to be very specific, and other countries also at the same point of time, and take an integrated approach for coastal zone management, water resources, agriculture, etc. Socioeconomic factor has also been given a due prominence here. In fact, to take all these climate change considerations to the extent feasible, the relevant socioeconomic and environmental policies and actions should employ appropriate methods. Like, for example, environment impact assessment that should be formulated and determined nationally, but of course, they should be viewed with an objective to minimize the adverse effects on the environment, but at the same point of time, they should also not cause any adverse effect on the economy or on quality of life at the same point of time. So human health is there, environment is there, but along with that, it should not also adversely affect the economy. So for that, you should also deploy certain measures from time to time, right? And this is something, environmental impact assessment is just a procedure, as you all know. But along with that, there are several challenges also which come across in this process. So, along with that, promotion, cooperation of scientific, technological, technical, socioeconomic, and other research-related activities has been promoted under the commitments of the countries. Parties have to commit to promote, cooperate scientific, technological, technical, socioeconomic, and other research-related activities. There should be full, open, and prompt sharing of information. So, information sharing is it's a scientific information, technical information, technological information, legal information, socioeconomic information. All these relevant information should be exchanged from time to time. In fact, which might be also related to economic and social, which might have some economic and social consequences on various response strategies. So that's why full, open, and prompt sharing of information have been emphasized under this. Along with that, promotion and cooperation with respect to capacity building by means of education, training, and public awareness have been also emphasized under the commitments of UNFCCC. All these country parties have been asked to adopt national policies, measures on mitigation of climate change. They have also been asked to calculate their emissions by sources, removals of sinks of greenhouse gases. Especially the developed countries have been given an additional responsibility. For that, you have to refer to Annexure 1 of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, where you will find the list of these developed countries where a specific commitment has been bestowed upon them. Like, each of these parties shall adopt national policies, and they should also take corresponding measures on mitigation of climate change. They have to limit their anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. They have to protect and enhance their greenhouse sinks and reservoirs. And these policies and measures shall also demonstrate that they are taking lead in modifying a very long-term trends in anthropogenic emissions consistent with the objective of this particular framework convention. And they should also recognize the return by the end of the present decade to the earlier levels of anthropogenic emissions of several such gases, which are of course not controlled by even other legal instruments like Montreal Protocol. And they would also contribute to such modification, taking into account the differences in these parties, their starting points, their approaches, their economic structures, their resource base, all needs to be maintained in a very strong and sustainable economic manner fashion. And all the available technologies or other individual circumstances should be taken into account with an equitable and very appropriate manner. And all these contributions should come from every country's developed countries, yes, of course, and should take the lead. But at the same point of time, other developing countries and other countries should also take appropriate measures to implement their policies, measures jointly with other parties. If any assistance is required, that should also be taken, and the developed country should render this assistance, which will effectively, in fact, contribute to the achievement of the objective of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, when it comes to developed countries, in fact, they have very significant responsibility in order to promote progress to this end. These developed countries shall also communicate from time to time all the necessary information on their policies and measures. There's a time period which they have mentioned. In fact, whatever they are doing individually in their national level or jointly in the regional level should all be taken into consideration. With respect to calculation of emissions by the sources and removal of sinks of greenhouse gases, they should also take into account the best available scientific knowledge, including the effective capacity of sinks and the respective contributions of such gases to climate change. So the conference of parties, in fact, under the Framework Convention shall also, in fact, along with that, the responsibilities which is there with the developed countries, even the COP has been given this direction by the Framework Convention to consider and agree on certain methodologies for these calculations. In fact, they have drawn their aspirations from ECTS, the European carbon emission system, which was in fact far more effective and efficient prior to the COP's, prior to the UNFCCC's carbon emissions, because Kyoto Protocol came. But they have drawn their inspirations from those pre-existing emission trading system, which is of course there. So all these things have to be done keeping in mind a due element of flexibility, and along with these developed countries, the developing countries should also coordinate as appropriate with other parties relevant documents which are required, administrative instruments on that which they have developed to achieve the objective of this convention. Periodical review, identification and periodical review of their own policies and practices have been also encouraged under this particular convention, and from time to time the Annex 1 countries and their responsibility as a lead in this entire process has been very significant. And the developed, and along with the Annex 1 countries, the developed country parties and other developed parties which are included in Annex 2 of the Framework Convention, even they have been given certain responsibilities. They should also provide new and additional financial resources to meet the agreed full cost that is to be incurred by the developing country parties in complying the provision of this particular Framework Convention, especially with respect to Article 12, which I will discuss subsequently in the future lecture. So Article 12 is very crucial, and in order to meet the objectives of Article 12, whatever is required, financial assistance, technology transfer, or even to meet the full incremental cost for implementing measures, all these things have been taken into account, and not just the Annex 1 developed countries, but also Annex 2 developed countries have been given the responsibility under Article 4 as a commitment. And the developed country parties and other developed country parties, those who are part and parcel of Annex 1, shall also assist the developing country parties that are particularly vulnerable to adverse effects of climate change. So Annex 1 countries as well as Annex 2 countries, they have clear responsibilities enshrined under Article 4, so-called the commitments of the Framework Convention, and due importance has been given to Article 12 and Article 10, which I'll discuss subsequently in one of the future lectures. In fact, if you refer to Article 10 of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, it basically talks about a subsidiary body on implementation, and Article 12, which emphasizes on communication of information related to implementation of this convention. So this is all for today's lecture on the Framework Convention on Climate Change and its significant principles, guiding principles, and preambular elements and commitments. So in the next class, I'll look into other aspects of Framework Convention on Climate Change, and then we'll move on to several key decisions which have been adopted from time to time by the Conference of Parties in this entire history of 25 years in the area of international climate change negotiation. So until then, take care of yourself, take care of your family, stay home, stay safe. Thank you very much.